Over the years, the board and staff at the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network have been very fortunate to work with some really talented people, and there's a number of them in the room today. And the next person that I want to introduce, his name is Rod MacLeod. He's somewhere here. I saw him before. There he is. Now, I don't know anyone that knows as much about two things: Montreal history. That's your guy. If you need to know about Montreal history, he knows everything about it. And education in the province of Quebec. And Rod has been a past president of our organization. He is currently, and has been for over 10 years, the editor of our beautiful quarterly magazine, which I will put a plug in. At the back, there are a number of copies. It would be great if people would like to join. You get a free subscription. I'm just going to mention that. Go and see our nice board member back there. Joanne is in the corner. So I want to invite Rod to come up and tell us all about education and the history of it. There he is.
I, too, have a checkered relationship with microphones. As Matthew said, I at one point was the president of QAHN, and I think when I first made a public appearance and somebody took a picture of me, I had this big microphone like this in front of my face. And that became my, every time I did something, or they needed a go-to picture of me, it always had this big carrot-shaped microphone in front of my face, to the point where, to this day, my kids just think of it and laugh their heads off. And they're getting on in years. So yes, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about a place that I'm really only discovering for the first time, which puts me in a slightly awkward position. But fortunately, Heather has introduced the history of this place beautifully, and she has left me one anecdote to tell about the Walbridge family. And this is an anecdote that Heather herself told me, so I take no care for it. But I thought it kind of introduced nicely what I was going to talk about, i.e. Schooling. So the anecdote is that in the early 1880s, Alexander Solomon Walbridge, that's the son of the guy with the horses and the rebels and all that sort of thing, went to the local school board, because he had school-age kids, and he said, wouldn't it be great if we had, I'm paraphrasing, wouldn't it be great if we built another story, or an extension, in this case a story, to the local school, so that we could offer the higher grades? Whether he was consciously making a pun on the idea of higher grades is a whole other question, but it turned out rather nicely. And the school board said, no, sorry, we can't do that. It's expensive. We don't, the kids that are around here don't necessarily need the higher grades because, well, they're only farm kids and blah, blah, blah. And also the expense is going to be to hire teachers. We have to have a whole other class of teacher and all this kind of thing. So they said no. And so Alexander Solomon Walbridge went back and secretly in his headquarters that Heather has described for you, his secret lab, created these sort of prefab walls and support structures and things. So that one day, when everyone else in town was off at a funeral, he and his guys came in, built the second story, and so when everyone came home again, there it was, a fait accompli, which is lovely. And presumably at that point they had no choice but to offer the higher grades. So I think this is a nice story, in part because it illustrates a number of things that keep coming up whenever you look at the history of local schooling in Quebec, and perhaps very specifically in the Eastern Townships. So first element in the story that I would tease out is the role of the local wealthy family. And you don't always find this kind of thing, and you don't necessarily need this kind of thing, but communities where they have a local people with some wealth or have that certain advantage, whether in this case they wanted it or not, it's kind of nice to have somebody to come forward and offer to subsidize whatever the the project might happen to be. In this case, it was building part of the school. And this often happened, not as blatantly as you would find with Mr. Walbridge, but very often you did have a local person with money who was forthcoming with some funding. The other thing that local landowners often did was donate land for the school. And this became an important thing because somebody had to do this. Somebody had to either buy the land, the school had to buy the land, or somebody had to donate it to the cause. And you also notice in this story that Walbridge's own children were attending this school, presumably, from what I can deduce from the story, because he wanted it in part, the extra features in part for them. He wanted them to benefit from the higher learning. And that's interesting, because we might have this image that people of a certain wealth would always automatically send their children away, perhaps even out of the province, out of the country, in some cases, in the early days, certainly. But here we have a case that clearly the local school is good enough for us. Another element that you see, very much by extension to that in this story, is the kids, the present of kids. And these are kids who are getting an education. A sense within the story that they don't need all that much education. Now that's perhaps where I would disagree with the tenor of that anecdote, because what I would suggest from all the work that I've done is that people in small communities throughout Quebec in the 19th century and perhaps ever since have actually been passionately interested in having their children educated. Not beyond the point where they can possibly use but certainly in Protestant communities, this idea that you want to learn the basics, you want to be able to read, i.e. the Bible, write arithmetic, basic learning at least, and other things preferably. So the idea that poor families' children didn't need education is perhaps a little bit overstated. The fact that even within some poor areas, there would always be kids who might be particularly intellectually endowed, who might feel, everyone says, this person should go further. There's always a place to send a child. It could be a local academy. In the case of, in case of everybody, but certainly in the case of older girls, as of 1857, you could send them into Montreal to go to the McGill Normal School, which was, among other things, a way of getting higher education. And the third element to bring from this anecdote is the presence of the school board. And we get this image that the school board is a kind of a penny-pinching, grumbling kind of organization that is sort of set against this maverick of Walbridge, who has this wonderful idea and is immediately shot down because we can't afford it and all that kind of thing that I'm sure all of us have heard at some point in our lives. Whenever we have brilliant ideas, there's always somebody out there that says, no, it's too expensive or whatever. And I think this is also an unfair image. I'm not blaming the anecdote, it's a great anecdote, but it's an unfair image of local school commissioners, which is one that I think we often have. If you read the school inspectors' reports from this time, you pick up on this because they are always heading around thinking, schools have to do X, Y, Z, and they're not always able to, and therefore it earns the scorn of school inspectors who, are all graduates from the school inspector school, and once they come from the government, so they know that they have a list of things that everyone's supposed to do. And local reality is often very, very different. And of course, that whole notion is reinforced by a sense I think we all have that, bureaucracy at some point is always, well, it's bureaucracy, and that, when you have, as I say, you have a good idea and it often gets shot down. School commissioners everywhere are local people. They are people who are elected by the community. They're elected to serve the community. They're elected to raise taxes from their neighbors, which is a thing I wouldn't want to have to do, and they have to spend that money with the neighbors that they know very well, watching what they're doing. I mean, there was a kind of built-in fiscal responsibility, which I think doesn't, obviously not going to overspend, but they also are aware that there's certain things that the community needs, and to their best of their ability, they're going to provide. They know their community. I would argue, and I spent a lot of time in my career arguing, that 19th century school boards were critical features of local democracy. And by extension, the community's connection with school officials is a crucial feature of schooling. This is progressively less so as you get into the 20th century, unfortunately, as the school boards themselves get larger, more centralized, cover more ground, become much harder to access by local people. But we forget this idea that school boards are, and I could step over a line into a political discussion that pertains to today, but to say that they are crucial elements of local democracy, and to do away with them, we are doing away with levels of local democracy. This tradition of local democracy certainly stems from long traditions in New England, at a civic level, but also at an educational level. So the influence that Heather was talking about loyalists and others from south of the border throughout the townships, but certainly in areas closer to the border, is very much a factor. You would see communities trying to figure out how they can set up schools. Sometimes it's a question of just having enough local resources that they can get somebody to teach, having one adult in the classroom. I didn't say that. Or keeping your ear out for whenever there's a new program, and there's a whole history of various programs that come up. The Royal Institution for the Advancement of Learning, which we associate today with the running of McGill, was originally a kind of a government body that local communities could turn to say, what, could I get some funding? In this case, usually they would send a teacher once they understood that the community had set aside land to build a school and hopefully actually build the school. A little later on, there was the assembly, before the Patriot came on the scene, or at least sensationally in 1937, the assembly that provided some of this funding too. But the crucial bit of legislation was in 1840, where a new law called for every township, so in this case we'd be talking about Stanbridge, right, would elect 5 commissioners to run the local schooling. They would raise taxes, which again, as I say, is a tricky thing to ask people to do. They would raise these taxes and spend them to hire teachers, to build and repair the schools, and of course to buy supplies. These township school boards were intended to be religiously neutral. They talked about common schools, and the law contained a provision that a religious minority could set up what was called a dissentient school. So there was a sort of an out if a certain group didn't feel that their needs were being represented. The townships were, at this point, through the late 19th century, heavily Protestant as opposed to Catholic. So a lot of the common school boards were effectively for Protestants. So as I say, Mystic would have been in Stanbridge Township. The school board served the whole area. I'm not sure exactly where the guys were, and they were always guys, that Walbridge went to. Sounds from the story like they were just here, but they might have been in some other part of the townships. I looked into some stats that I had and dug them out of drawers, knowing I was giving this talk. So I discovered an 1850 report from the superintendent of education, who writes down every single community in the province and how many schools they're running and so forth. So in 1850, the township of Stanbridge offered 18 common schools, of which this was one, or would have been one. I guess it was built a little later. But there were no dissentient schools, and in fact, there were no dissentient schools anywhere in Missisquoi, according to this report. So again, there hadn't been any sensitivity at this point to the needs of a religious minority. Eventually, you get a larger Catholic presence, and I guess that's strong enough by the 1870s to create the parish of Saint Ignace de Stanbridge. Again, someone may know more about this than I do. And I assume at some point there would be a Catholic dissentient school. The Mystic School that we were going to see, I believe, closed in the 1940s. But again, I uncovered a 1937 report which gives statistics. Again, it's a survey of Protestant schools. And it lists Saint Ignace de Missisquoi, which I assume is this school. And that is, I guess it's, at the time, that was what this municipality would have been called. And I don't know enough about the origin of, or the evolution of local governance around here. But anyway. So when it came to the question of secondary education, because that was Walbridge's whole idea, right, is to let's build room so that our kids can have some extra grades. Well, that's interesting. There was certainly a supply by the 1880s of academies. This is this sort of, before there were high schools, there were local academies, which is, again, is a tradition you see coming from New England. You could have gone in different directions, and I'm disoriented, so I won't point. But between Dunham and Clarenceville and Cowansville and Stanbridge, Phillipsburg, Fredericksburg, and Bedford, most of these, by the 1880s, there would have been some choice to have sent your children to if you wanted them to have a little bit extra. But it's always nice when the kids can go get the extra grades nearby. So again, a trend in the 19th century is very much to make the higher grades as accessible as possible, as close as possible. So you start seeing schools, whenever they can, offer the extra grades by either building another classroom. Again, this is not unusual. Circumstances are unusual, but the desire to have an extra space is not unusual. So either by adding a classroom to give it model status, right, which is sort of what we later call would be intermediate school. And we see a lot of this happening in here. So just to conclude, unfortunately, the 20th century, again, would see a decline of this. So just as you start in the 19th century, see higher education being more and more convenient, this disappears and slowly gets out of control by the 20th century, where kids have to be sent further and further away. There's what's called the consolidation movement in the early part of the century, where the idea is let's build what they called consolidated schools, multi-classroom schools. So we could close down a lot of the little local schools and send all the kids off to a consolidated school. And then, of course, over time, those consolidated schools are no longer that useful, and they get closed down, and all the kids are bussed into what used to be high schools, and then those schools are closed down, and they get bussed into the regional schools. Anyway. But I'm very curious to visit the Mystic School, because I'd like to see what sort of, we don't have very many 19th century schools left, and this is a rare example. But it certainly fits into a network of schooling and a network of expectation that parents and communities would have had for their children, even at a very modest social level, that they were going to be able to learn as much as they needed, and maybe even a little bit more. So thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you in some of these great sites that we're going to visit.
I understand there were 7 buildings, and this figure in the doorway we can take to be Alexander Solomon Walbridge himself, greeting a customer coming up to his door with a horse and wagon.